The year is 1860, and the United States of America stands on the precipice of its greatest trial. In the span of just 4 years, this young nation will experience a trauma so profound that its scars remain visible today, over 160 years later. Picture this. A country that had prided itself on being indivisible suddenly splits in two, with brothers taking up arms against brothers, fathers disowning sons, and neighbors becoming mortal enemies. What force could be so powerful as to tear apart the fabric of American society? How did a nation founded on the principle that all men are created equal come to wage war over the very meaning of those words? The American Civil War wasn't just a conflict between North and South. It was a violent reckoning with contradictions that had been building since the nation's founding. Today, we embark on an epic journey through the most defining period in American history. We'll witness how economic differences, moral conflicts, and political failures created an unstoppable momentum toward war. We'll all see how the conflict transformed from a limited dispute about union to a total war that revolutionized American society. And we'll discover how the attempt to rebuild the nation created new divisions that echo through our politics today. This is the story of how America nearly destroyed itself in order to fulfill its founding promise, and how that destruction ultimately forged a stronger, though forever changed, Union. Chapter 1. The House Divided, 1820 to 1850. In 1819, the Missouri Territory asked Congress for admission as a state, and immediately the chamber exploded with fury. Lawmakers shouted across the floor, some threatening to walk out for good. The real fight was not over Missouri's readiness for statehood, but over whether slavery would move westward alongside the nation's growth. That single question split open the hidden fault line within the American Republic. From his retirement at Monticello, an aging Thomas Jefferson watched with dread. He described the controversy as a fire bell in the night, confessing that it terrified him. What the Missouri debate revealed was stark. The Founding Fathers had not resolved the issue of slavery. They had merely pushed it into the future. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 temporarily cooled the crisis. Henry Clay, soon known as the Great Compromiser, engineered an agreement. Missouri would join as a slave state, while Maine entered as free, keeping the balance in the Senate intact. Even more significant, Congress established a boundary at latitude 3,630 across the Louisiana Territory. Slavery permitted south of the line, banned to the north. This geographic fix, however, could not hide the deeper divide. Many Northerners increasingly saw slavery as a moral stain on the nation, one that must be halted and ultimately destroyed. Ministers preached against it, newspapers circulated harrowing slave narratives, and politicians framed freedom as America's true destiny. The founding of the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1833 gave this moral energy an organized political voice. Southerners moved in the opposite direction. Led by John C. Calhoun, they began promoting slavery not as a regrettable necessity, but as a positive good. Southern thinkers claimed the system benefited all involved. Enslaved Africans received care, while white planters gained the leisure to pursue culture and politics. They pointed to Greece and Rome as proof that advanced societies required a servile labor class. Economic change hardened the division. Eli Whitney's cotton gin transformed slavery into the foundation of Southern prosperity. Cotton exports soon powered not just the South, but the entire U.S. economy, funding factories in the North, underwriting federal revenues, and backing loans abroad. By 1850, more than half of America's exports came from cotton grown by enslaved labor. Meanwhile, the North underwent its own economic revolution. Factories multiplied, cities swelled, and waves of immigrants provided free labor. Northern investors poured money into railroads, telegraph lines, and machines. To them, the future of America lay in free labor, innovation, and expanding markets, not slavery. These competing worldviews collided again and again. The nullification crisis of 1832 saw South Carolina threaten to defy federal tariffs, testing Washington's authority. The gag rule in Congress blocked anti-slavery petitions, but only deepened Northern outrage. When Texas joined the Union as a slave state in 1845, it triggered war with Mexico, once more raising Jefferson his nightmare: what to do with vast new lands. The Mexican-American War reignited the question of expansion. David Wilmot introduced a proposal to bar slavery from all conquered territories. It passed the House but failed in the Senate. Out of this clash arose the Free Soil Party, whose motto, "Free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men," captured the mood of many Northerners. Southern leaders grew more combative. They developed constitutional theories to argue that Congress had no power to block slavery in the territories. Threats of secession became more frequent and more serious. Radical fire-eaters like William Lowndes Yancey insisted the Union itself was hostile to the South and should be left behind. Between 1820 and 1850, a pattern was set. Every compromise that appeared to settle the slavery question only made the next dispute more explosive. The Missouri Compromise created the illusion that balance could be maintained, but each new crisis proved harder to contain. Over time, the conflict stopped being merely political and became a moral crusade. Abolitionists in the North and pro-slavery ideologues in the South erased the middle ground. By the dawn of the 1850s, as the nation prepared for its greatest territorial growth since the Louisiana Purchase, one fact was clear: no political deal could hold the country together forever. Chapter 2. The Compromise That Failed, 1850 to 1854. The Senate Chamber in January 1850 witnesses the last great performance of the antebellum era's political titans. Henry Clay, now 73 and visibly frail, rises to propose one final compromise to save the Union. Daniel Webster, the North's greatest orator, will soon shock his constituents by supporting Clay's plan. John C. Calhoun, dying of tuberculosis, sits wrapped in blankets as a colleague reads his final speech warning of Southern secession. These three giants of American politics know they're fighting for the nation's survival. California's gold rush has created a crisis that threatens to shatter the delicate sectional balance. The stakes have never been higher, and time is running out. The California gold rush transforms American demographics overnight. In 1848, California has perhaps 14,000 non-native residents. By 1850, over 100,000 people have flooded into the territory, creating an instant need for government and law. California's residents draft a constitution prohibiting slavery and petition for immediate statehood, threatening to upset the carefully maintained balance between free and slave states. Texas complicates matters further by claiming vast territories extending into present-day New Mexico, Colorado, and even parts of Wyoming. If Texas keeps these lands, they'll likely become slave territory. The federal government owes Texas millions from the Republic era, creating additional leverage for Southern demands. Most explosively, abolitionists demand an end to slavery in Washington, D.C. The spectacle of slave auctions within sight of the Capitol embarrasses the nation internationally. Frederick Douglass describes the horror. The very spot where American liberty was declared to the world is desecrated by the presence of slavery. Henry Clay crafts the Compromise of 1850 as an omnibus bill addressing all these issues simultaneously. California enters as a free state, but the rest of the Mexican Cession organizes as Utah and New Mexico territories without restrictions on slavery, letting popular sovereignty decide their fate. Texas receives $10 million for surrendering its territorial claims. The slave trade ends in Washington, D.C., but slavery itself continues. Most controversially, a strengthened Fugitive Slave Act requires all Americans to assist in capturing runaway slaves. The debate consumes Congress for 8 months. Clay argues that the Union faces furious and angry waves of passion that only compromise can calm. Webster, 7th of March. Speech supporting the compromise destroys his reputation among abolitionists, but provides crucial Northern support. Calhoun's final speech, read aloud because he's too weak to deliver it, warns that the Union can only survive if the North stops agitating against slavery and allows the South equal rights in the territories. A new generation of politicians emerges during this crisis. William Seward of New York invokes a higher law than the Constitution, the law of God that prohibits slavery. Jefferson Davis of Mississippi argues that the Constitution explicitly protects slavery and cannot be compromised away. Stephen Douglas of Illinois champions popular sovereignty as a democratic solution to the territorial question. The omnibus bill fails, but Douglas rescues the compromise by breaking it into separate measures. Each bill passes with different coalitions, Southern Democrats and Northern Whigs supporting the Fugitive Slave Act, Northern Democrats and some Whigs admitting California, and so forth. President Millard Fillmore signs all 5 bills, declaring the slavery question settled for all time. The public initially celebrates the compromise of 1,850. Mass rallies in major cities praise the preservation of the Union. Business confidence returns as the threat of secession recedes. Both major parties pledge to accept the compromise as a final settlement of sectional differences. But the Fugitive Slave Act poisons Northern opinion almost immediately. The law strips accused fugitives of basic legal protections: no jury trial, no right to testify, no appeal. Federal commissioners receive $10 for returning someone to slavery, but only $5 for releasing them. Any citizen who refuses to assist slave catchers faces heavy fines and imprisonment. The sight of federal marshals dragging alleged fugitives through northern cities inflames abolitionist sentiment. The case of Anthony Burns in Boston requires federal troops to return him to slavery while thousands of protesters line the streets. Harriet Beecher Stowe begins writing Uncle Tom's Cabin as a direct response to the Fugitive Slave Act, creating the most influential piece of anti-slavery propaganda in American history. The Compromise of 1850 provides temporary peace, but at a terrible cost. It forces ordinary Northerners to become complicit in slavery as enforcement. The Fugitive Slave Act creates more abolitionists than decades of speeches and pamphlets. Meanwhile, Southerners become convinced that only federal power can protect their interests, abandoning their traditional states' rights position when it suits their needs. Most dangerously, the compromise establishes popular sovereignty as the method for determining slavery in new territories. This seemingly democratic solution will soon transform Kansas Territory into a battlefield and destroy the last vestiges of political compromise. Chapter 3: Bleeding Kansas and the Death of Compromise, 1854-1857. Lawrence, Kansas Territory, May 21, 1856. A pro-slavery militia surrounds the Free State town, cannon aimed at the Free State Hotel. What began as a political dispute over Kansas's future has escalated into actual warfare. The attackers call themselves law enforcement. The defenders consider them invaders. As the hotel burns and printing presses are destroyed, America witnesses something unprecedented: armed conflict between its own citizens over the expansion of slavery. 3 days later, in retaliation for bleeding Lawrence, a wild-eyed abolitionist named John Brown leads a midnight raid that leaves 5 pro-slavery settlers dead along Pottawatomie Creek. The Kansas Territory has become America's first preview of civil war. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 represents Stephen Douglas's greatest political miscalculation. Eager to build a transcontinental railroad through his home state of Illinois, Douglas needs to organize the vast Nebraska Territory. But this region lies north of the 3630 line established by the Missouri Compromise, meaning it should automatically become free territory. Southern senators refuse to support territorial organization that will create more free states. Douglas believes he can solve this problem through popular sovereignty. Let the settlers themselves vote on slavery. This seemingly reasonable democratic solution requires repealing the Missouri Compromise, the sacred compact that has maintained sectional peace for over 30 years. Douglas underestimates the Northern reaction. The Missouri Compromise repeal triggers massive protests across the North. Anti-Nebraska meetings in Chicago, Detroit, and Milwaukee draw thousands of angry citizens. Newspapers that previously avoided the slavery question now denounce Douglas as a traitor to freedom. Protestant ministers preach that God will punish America for breaking faith with liberty. The political realignment begins immediately. Northern Whigs abandon their party en masse, joining with Free Soil Democrats and Know-Nothings to form an entirely new political organization. They call themselves Republicans, invoking the revolutionary generation's commitment to freedom. Their platform is simple but revolutionary. No more slave states, ever. Kansas becomes the testing ground for popular sovereignty, and both sides move quickly to control the territory's future. The New England Emigrant Aid Company sponsors free state settlements, providing financing, weapons, and supplies. These emigrants establish Lawrence and Topeka as free state strongholds. Pro-slavery Missourians, led by Senator David Atchison, organize their own migration. They establish Leavenworth and Atchison as pro-slavery bases. The competition turns violent almost immediately. Elections become shams as thousands of armed Missourians cross the border to vote illegally, then return home. They elect a pro-slavery territorial legislature that immediately legalizes slavery and makes questioning slavery's legality a felony. Free state settlers refuse to recognize this bogus legislature and establish their own government in Topeka. President Franklin Pierce faces an impossible choice. He can recognize the pro-slavery government and infuriate the North, or support the free state government and trigger Southern secession threats. Pierce chooses to back the official territorial government, sending federal troops to enforce pro-slavery laws against free state rebels. Violence escalates throughout 1855 and 1856. The Wakarusa War brings 1,500 armed men to Lawrence's defense before cooler heads arrange a temporary truce. The sack of Lawrence demonstrates that peaceful coexistence has become impossible. John Brown's Pottawatomie Massacre proves that some abolitionists will answer violence with violence. The Kansas conflict transforms national politics. Charles Sumner's Crime Against Kansas speech in the Senate delivers such a fierce personal attack on South Carolina as Andrew Butler that Butler's cousin, Representative Preston Brooks, beats Sumner unconscious with a walking cane on the Senate floor. The North sees this as proof that slavery corrupts democratic institutions. The South sees Sumner's speech as an unforgivable insult to Southern honor. The 1856 presidential election becomes a referendum on Kansas and slavery expansion. The new Republican Party nominates John C. Fremont on a platform of free soil, free speech, and Fremont. Democrats choose James Buchanan, promising to restore peace through popular sovereignty. The American Know-Nothing Party nominates Millard Fillmore, appealing to voters tired of sectional conflict. Buchanan wins, but the results reveal dangerous sectional polarization. Fremont carries most northern states despite being a first-time candidate from a brand-new party. Buchanan wins only because Pennsylvania and Illinois remain Democratic. Most ominously, Fremont receives virtually no Southern votes, while Buchanan gets almost none in New England. The Dred Scott decision in March 1857 attempts to resolve the territorial question through judicial authority. Chief Justice Roger Taney rules that Congress has no power to prohibit slavery in federal territories, making the Missouri Compromise and popular sovereignty equally unconstitutional. African Americans, Taney declares, had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. Republicans denounced Dred Scott as a pro-slavery conspiracy between Taney and Buchanan. Abraham Lincoln warns that the Supreme Court's logic could legalize slavery nationwide. Frederick Douglass calls the decision judicial tyranny and predicts it will strengthen the abolitionist cause. The Kansas-Nebraska Act destroys the second-party system and creates the Republican Party as a purely sectional organization. More importantly, it demonstrates that popular sovereignty cannot resolve the slavery question peacefully. It only transfers the conflict from Congress to the territories themselves. Bleeding Kansas proves that slavery expansion will be decided by force, not votes. The violence that begins in Kansas territory will soon spread to the United States Congress and eventually consume the entire nation. America has lost the ability to manage its fundamental contradiction through political compromise. Chapter 4. The Final Crisis, 1857 to 1861. Springfield, Illinois, June 16, 1858. A lanky prairie lawyer named Abraham Lincoln accepts the Republican nomination for U.S. Senate with words that will echo through history. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. The assembled delegates sit in stunned silence. Lincoln has just declared that the slavery question must be settled decisively one way or another. His opponent, Stephen Douglas, will dismiss Lincoln as a dangerous radical who threatens the Union. But Lincoln understands what Douglas cannot see. The compromises have failed. Popular sovereignty has failed. And America faces a choice between freedom and slavery. There can be no middle ground. The Lecompton Constitution crisis of 1857 to 1858 destroys the last hope for peaceful resolution in Kansas. Pro-slavery settlers, now clearly outnumbered by free state immigrants, rush to write a state constitution before they lose control entirely. Meeting in Lecompton, they draft a document that protects existing slavery and allows voters only to choose whether additional slaves can be brought into Kansas, not whether to abolish slavery entirely. President Buchanan faces enormous pressure to accept the Lecompton Constitution. His entire cabinet supports it. Southern Democrats threaten to leave the party if he rejects it, and he desperately wants to end the Kansas crisis. Despite clear evidence of fraud and the Free State majority's boycott of the ratification vote, Buchanan submits Lecompton to Congress for approval. Stephen Douglas breaks with his own party and president over Lecompton. Popular sovereignty means nothing if settlers cannot genuinely choose their institutions. Douglas's opposition splits the Democratic Party along sectional lines and effectively ends his presidential ambitions in the South. Republicans gain an unexpected ally, but Douglas's motives remain suspect. He opposes Lecompton not from anti-slavery conviction, but from democratic principle. The Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858 crystallized the fundamental issues dividing America. Lincoln argues that slavery is morally wrong and must be placed in the course of ultimate extinction. Douglas insists that local democracy should decide slavery's fate without moral interference from outsiders. Their 7 debates across Illinois draw national attention and establish Lincoln as a major Republican figure. At Freeport, Lincoln poses a devastating question. Can territorial settlers exclude slavery despite the Dred Scott decision? Douglas responds that they can refuse to pass local laws protecting slavery, making it impossible to maintain in practice. This Freeport doctrine satisfies Illinois voters but infuriates Southerners who demand federal protection for slave property. The debates reveal irreconcilable differences over slavery's morality and future. Lincoln insists that declaring slavery wrong leads inevitably to restricting its expansion. Douglas argues that moral neutrality preserves both democracy and union. Neither man can bridge the gap between these positions. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in October 1859 transforms the national mood from political disagreement to apocalyptic fear. Brown's plan to seize the federal arsenal and arm enslaved people for rebellion represents Southerners' worst nightmare. Though quickly suppressed by Robert A. Lee's Marines, the raid's psychological impact proves devastating. Brown's trial and execution create a martyr for the abolitionist cause. Ralph Waldo Emerson calls Brown a new saint who will make the gallows as glorious as the cross. Henry David Thoreau compares Brown to Jesus Christ. Church bells toll across New England on the day of Brown's execution. Southerners see Brown's lionization as proof that the North has embraced slave rebellion and racial war. Governor Henry Wise of Virginia warns that Brown represents mainstream Republican sentiment disguised as radicalism. Fire eaters use Harper's Ferry to argue that remaining in the Union means accepting eventual abolition and race war. The 1860 presidential election destroys the Democratic Party as a national organization. Southern Democrats bolt the Charleston Convention when Northern delegates refuse to support a federal slave code for territories. They nominate John C. Breckinridge on a platform demanding constitutional protection for slavery everywhere. Northern Democrats choose Stephen Douglas, still advocating popular sovereignty. Republicans nominate Abraham Lincoln as a moderate alternative to William Seward, who seems too radical for crucial swing states. Lincoln's platform promises only to prevent slavery's expansion, not to interfere with it where it exists. Constitutional Unionists nominate John Bell, desperately trying to avoid the slavery question entirely. The election results confirm the nation's sectional division. Lincoln wins with only 40% of the popular vote, but carries every northern state except New Jersey. Breckinridge sweeps the Deep South. Douglas holds Missouri and New Jersey, and Bell takes 3 border states. Most ominously, Lincoln receives fewer than 40,000 votes in the entire South, demonstrating that half the country rejects him completely. South Carolina secedes on December 20, 1860, declaring that the union heretofore existing between this state and the other states of North America is hereby dissolved. 6 more Deep South states follow by February 1861. They form the Confederate States of America with Jefferson Davis as president, creating a new nation dedicated to protecting slavery. Lincoln faces an impossible situation during the secession winter. He cannot compromise on slavery expansion without destroying the Republican Party, but he cannot preserve the Union without some concession to Southern fears. Various compromise proposals founder on Republican opposition to any extension of slavery. The period from 1857 to 1861 demonstrates that American democracy cannot resolve the slavery question. Every attempt at compromise, Lecompton, the Freeport Doctrine, the Crittenden Compromise fails because the underlying moral conflict has become irreconcilable. Lincoln's election on a platform of slavery restriction triggers secession because Southerners correctly understand that restriction means eventual abolition. America now faces its ultimate test: whether a nation conceived in liberty can survive when half its people reject the democratic process itself. The war that follows will answer fundamental questions about the nature of American democracy, the meaning of freedom, and the price of union. Chapter 5. The war begins 186-11862. Charleston Harbor, 4:30 a.m., April 12, 1861. Confederate artillery opens fire on Fort Sumter, the federal garrison that has become a symbol of divided loyalty. Major Robert Anderson, commanding the fort, has taught many of the Confederate officers now bombarding him. The first shots of the Civil War come not from invading armies, but from Americans firing on Americans. President Lincoln has maneuvered the Confederacy into firing first, transforming secession from a political dispute into armed rebellion. The war that both sides expected to last weeks will consume 4 years and claim more American lives than all other conflicts combined. The Fort Sumter crisis crystallizes the fundamental question facing America. Does the federal government have the authority to hold its property within seceded states? Lincoln understands that evacuating Sumter would recognize Confederate independence, while reinforcing it could trigger war. His decision to resupply the fort rather than reinforce it forces Jefferson Davis to choose between accepting federal presence or opening fire. The bombardment of Fort Sumter electrifies Northern opinion. Democrats who oppose Lincoln rally to the flag, viewing Confederate attack on federal property as treason. Stephen Douglas publicly supports Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. The attack transforms a sectional political dispute into a patriotic crusade to preserve the Union. Lincoln's call for troops forces the crucial decision on 8 slave states that had rejected secession. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas joined the Confederacy rather than provide troops against their southern neighbors. Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Delaware remain in the Union despite significant Confederate sympathy. The loss of Virginia proved particularly devastating, providing the Confederacy with its capital in Richmond and its finest military leader in Robert E. Lee. Both sides initially expect a brief conflict. Northerners march to war singing, "We'll hang Jeff Davis from a sour apple tree," and predicting victory before summer ends. Confederates boast that one Southern gentleman can whip 10 Yankees. Neither side has professional armies, adequate weapons, or realistic understanding of modern war's requirements. The First Battle of Bull Run on July 21, 1861, shocks both nations with its chaos and carnage. Union forces under Irvin McDowell attack Confederate positions near Manassas Junction, initially driving the rebels back. But Confederate reinforcements arriving by railroad, the first time trains play a decisive role in battle, turn the tide. Union retreat becomes rout as panicked soldiers flee toward Washington alongside congressmen and civilians who had come to watch the grand spectacle of war. Bull Run demonstrates that this will not be a 90-day war. Both sides begin raising massive armies, the Union eventually mobilizing 2.8 million men, the Confederacy perhaps 1.2 million. These numbers dwarf all previous American military experience and strain both societies to their breaking points. George McClellan emerges as the Union's apparent savior after Bull Run. Young, charismatic, and supremely confident, Little Mac transforms demoralized volunteers into the Army of the Potomac. His organizational genius creates a formidable fighting force, but his extreme caution and political ambitions frustrate Lincoln's demand for aggressive action. The Confederacy faces different challenges. Jefferson Davis must create a new nation while fighting a war for its survival. Unlike Lincoln, who can build on existing federal institutions, Davis must establish everything from scratch: cabinet departments, diplomatic corps, tax collection, currency system, and military organization. The Confederacy's commitment to states' rights complicates even basic governmental functions. Naval warfare assumes crucial importance as Lincoln proclaims a blockade of Confederate ports. The Union Navy grows from 42 ships to over 670, gradually strangling Southern trade. Confederate efforts to break the blockade through commerce raiders like the Alabama and Revolutionary ironclad warships achieve tactical success but cannot overcome overwhelming Northern numerical superiority. The Peninsula Campaign of 1862 reveals McClellan's strategic limitations. Rather than advance directly on Richmond, McClellan transports 100,000 men to the Virginia Peninsula for an indirect approach. His methodical advance brings Union forces within sight of the Confederate capital. But Robert E. Lee's appointment as Confederate commander changes everything. Lee immediately attacks McClellan in the 7 Days battles, driving the Union Army back to Harrison's Landing despite heavy Confederate casualties. Lee's aggressive tactics establish him as the Confederacy's premier general and demonstrate the Army of Northern Virginia as fighting qualities. McClellan's retreat, despite numerical superiority, convinces Lincoln that a new strategy is needed. The war's scope expands far beyond the Eastern Theater. Union forces capture New Orleans in April 1862, providing a foothold in the Confederacy's heartland. Ulysses S. Grant emerges as a capable commander in the Western Theater, capturing Forts Henry and Donelson and fighting the bloody Battle of Shiloh. The war has growing scale and casualties shock both sides. Shiloh's two-day toll exceeds all previous American battle deaths combined. The war's first year destroys all illusions about quick victory. Both sides discover that citizen soldiers can fight with devastating effectiveness when properly led and motivated. The conflict evolves from a limited war to preserve the Union into a total war that will transform American society completely. Most importantly, military necessity begins driving policy toward emancipation. Escaped slaves flock to Union lines, forcing commanders to decide whether to return contraband to their owners or treat them as free people. Lincoln's initial reluctance to make slavery a war issue cannot survive the logic of events. The Confederacy's rebellion is fundamentally about preserving slavery, and Union victory requires destroying the institution that sustains Confederate resistance. Chapter 6: The Emancipation Transformation, 1862 to 1863. The White House, New Year's Day, 1863. Abraham Lincoln's hand trembles slightly as he prepares to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. He pauses, flexing his fingers not from nervousness, but because he has been shaking hands with visitors all morning. "If my name ever goes down in history," Lincoln says, "it will be for this act." The pen touches paper, transforming a war to preserve the Union into a crusade for human freedom. In one stroke, Lincoln frees 3.5 million enslaved people and changes the war's fundamental character. The Confederacy now fights not just for independence, but for its entire social order. The Union fights not just for union, but for the proposition that all people deserve freedom. The path to emancipation begins with military necessity, not moral conviction. Union armies encounter thousands of escaped slaves seeking freedom behind federal lines. General Benjamin Butler declares these refugees contraband of war, refusing to return valuable property to Confederate owners. Congress passes confiscation acts authorizing the seizure of rebel property, including enslaved people. Lincoln initially resists emancipation as both unconstitutional and politically dangerous. He fears driving border states into the Confederacy and splitting the fragile Union coalition. His letter to Horace Greeley in August 1862 articulates this position. "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, with or without slavery." But by summer 1862, Lincoln recognizes that slavery and rebellion are inseparable. The Confederacy uses enslaved labor to build fortifications, transport supplies, and maintain agriculture while white men fight. Destroying slavery weakens Confederate war capacity while strengthening Union forces with black recruits. Emancipation also prevents European intervention by transforming the conflict into a moral crusade. The preliminary Emancipation Proclamation of September 22, 1862, gives Confederate states 100 days to rejoin the Union and keep slavery intact. Lincoln times the announcement carefully, waiting for a Union military victory to demonstrate strength. The Battle of Antietam provides the necessary success, though McClellan's failure to pursue Lee's retreating army frustrates the president. The proclamation's careful legal language reflects Lincoln's constitutional constraints. As a war measure, emancipation can only apply to states in rebellion, not to loyal border states or Union-occupied Confederate territory. The document frees enslaved people in areas where the federal government cannot enforce freedom while leaving slavery intact where federal authority prevails. Critics attack the proclamation from all sides. Democrats denounce it as unconstitutional tyranny that will prolong the war and trigger slave rebellions. Radical Republicans dismiss it as too limited, affecting only rebels while protecting loyal slaveholders. Confederates use it as proof that Lincoln seeks to destroy Southern society and incite racial warfare. But the proclamation's impact transcends its legal limitations. African Americans throughout the Union celebrate January 1, 1863, as a day of jubilee. Frederick Douglass calls it the first step in the nation's departure from the thraldom of ages. Enslaved people across the Confederacy hear rumors of freedom and begin abandoning plantations in increasing numbers. European reaction proves equally significant. British working classes had opposed American slavery despite supporting Confederate independence. The Emancipation Proclamation makes supporting the Confederacy politically impossible for liberal Europeans. Union diplomatic efforts emphasize the moral dimension of the conflict, preventing recognition of Confederate independence. The recruitment of black soldiers represents the war's most revolutionary development. Initially limited to support roles, African Americans soon serve in combat units throughout the Union Army. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry's assault on Fort Wagner demonstrates black soldiers' courage under fire. By war's end, nearly 200,000 African Americans serve in Union forces, 10% of total Northern military strength. Black military service transforms both races' attitudes toward citizenship and equality. White soldiers initially resist serving alongside African Americans, but gradually recognize their fighting qualities. Black soldiers understand that military service earns claims to political equality. Their performance in battle undermines racial stereotypes and strengthens arguments for civil rights. The war's escalating brutality reflects its changing character. Confederate forces massacre black soldiers at Fort Pillow and Petersburg, refusing to treat them as legitimate prisoners of war. Union retaliation escalates the cycle of violence. Sherman's march through Georgia and South Carolina brings total war to Confederate civilians. The conflict becomes a struggle for social revolution, not just political control. The Battle of Gettysburg in July 1863 marks the war's turning point. Lee's second invasion of the North culminates in 3 days of desperate fighting that cost both armies grievously. Pickett's charge on the third day represents the Confederacy's high water mark, the furthest penetration of Union territory. Lee's retreat to Virginia ends Confederate hopes for foreign recognition and Northern war weariness. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address transforms the battlefield dedication into a meditation on democracy and sacrifice. In 272 words, Lincoln redefines the war's purpose from preserving the old Union to creating a new birth of freedom. The address connects the Civil War to the revolutionary generation's unfinished work, making emancipation essential to American democracy's survival. Simultaneously, Grant's siege of Vicksburg splits the Confederacy along the Mississippi River. The fortress city's surrender on July 4, 1863, gives the Union complete control of the river and isolates Confederate forces west of the Mississippi. Combined with Gettysburg, Vicksburg marks the beginning of inevitable Confederate defeat. Emancipation fundamentally transforms the Civil War from a constitutional crisis into a social revolution. The Union now fights for principles that will reshape American society completely. Confederate defeat will mean not just political reunion, but the destruction of slavery and the birth of a new America based on freedom and equality. The war has evolved beyond anything either side originally imagined, setting the stage for the most destructive and transformative phase of the conflict. Chapter 7. Total War and Confederate Collapse 1864-1865. Cold Harbor, Virginia, June 3, 1864. In the space of 30 minutes, Ulysses S. Grant loses 7,000 men in a futile assault against Confederate entrenchments. The slaughter is so horrific that Grant will later call it the one attack he regrets ordering. But unlike his predecessors, Grant does not retreat after a bloody repulse. He moves his army around Lee's flank and continues south toward Richmond. This is the new reality of 1864. a war of attrition where Union numerical superiority will eventually grind down Confederate resistance. Grant understands what Lincoln has learned. This rebellion can only be crushed through total war that destroys not just Confederate armies, but the Southern society that sustains them. Grant's appointment as General-in-Chief in March 1864 brings coordinated strategy to Union war efforts for the first time. His plan is elegantly simple. Apply pressure simultaneously on all fronts, preventing Confederates from shifting troops between theaters. Grant will accompany the Army of the Potomac against Lee, while Sherman marched through Georgia toward Atlanta. Smaller forces will campaign in the Shenandoah Valley and along the coast. The overland campaign reveals both Grant's determination and the war's terrible evolution. At the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor, Grant suffers enormous casualties but continues advancing. Previous Union commanders would have retreated across the Potomac after such losses. Grant moves toward Petersburg, forcing Lee into siege warfare that placed the Union advantages in manpower and material. Sherman's Atlanta campaign demonstrates the war's expansion beyond purely military targets. Sherman's 100,000-man army advances methodically through Georgia, destroying railroads, factories, and anything else that might support Confederate war efforts. When Atlanta falls on September 2, 1864, Sherman telegraphs Lincoln, "Atlanta is ours, and fairly won." The capture of Atlanta transforms Northern morale and probably saves Lincoln's presidency. Throughout the summer of 1864, war weariness had grown as casualty lists mounted without decisive results. Democrats nominate George McClellan on a platform calling the war a failure and demanding immediate negotiations. Atlanta's fall proves that Confederate resistance is weakening and Union victory is achievable. Sherman's march to the sea represents total war's logical conclusion. Rather than pursuing Confederate armies, Sherman marched 62,000 men across Georgia to Savannah, living off the land and destroying everything useful to the Confederate war effort. His troops burn Atlanta before departing, leaving only churches, hospitals, and private homes standing. The march devastates Georgian morale as much as Georgian infrastructure. Sherman's soldiers destroy railroads, confiscate livestock, and liberate enslaved people by the thousands. Confederate forces cannot stop the advance. Hood's army has marched into Tennessee, leaving Georgia defenseless. Sherman's men cut a swath of destruction 60 miles wide and 300 miles long, proving that the Confederacy cannot protect its own heartland. Sherman presents Savannah to Lincoln as a Christmas gift in December 1864, then turns north into South Carolina. His troops show even less mercy to the state they blame for starting the war. Columbia burns. Whether from Confederate evacuation fires or Union arson remains disputed, but the symbolic impact is clear. The cradle of secession lies in ruins. The war's human cost reaches staggering proportions by 1864. Grant's campaigns cost the Union 60,000 casualties in 6 weeks, leading newspapers to call him the Butcher. But Confederate losses are proportionally worse and irreplaceable. Lee's army shrinks from 65,000 to 35,000 men as desertion accelerates and reinforcements dwindle. Behind Confederate lines, society disintegrates under the pressure of total war. Confederate currency becomes worthless as inflation reaches 9,000%. Food riots break out in Richmond and other cities as ordinary citizens face starvation. The Confederate draft exempts slaveholders and those who can afford substitutes, creating class resentment that undermines Confederate morale. The election of 1864 becomes a referendum on Lincoln's war policies. McClellan campaigns on ending the war through negotiation, implicitly accepting Confederate independence. Lincoln insists that reunion and emancipation are non-negotiable. His re-election by a substantial margin demonstrates Northern commitment to seeing the war through to complete victory. Confederate desperation leads to increasingly radical measures. The Confederate Congress authorizes the recruitment of enslaved soldiers in exchange for freedom, a complete repudiation of the racial theories that justified secession. Robert E. Lee supports the measure, arguing that enslaved people will fight for their homes regardless of their legal status. But the war ends before significant numbers of black Confederates can be recruited. The Siege of Petersburg through the winter of 1864 to 1865 demonstrates the Confederacy's final collapse. Lee's army, reduced to 35,000 effective troops, faces Grant's 125,000 across elaborate trench systems that preview World War I. Confederate soldiers desert in increasing numbers as news arrives of Sherman's march and their families' suffering. The fall of Richmond on April 3, 1865, marks the effective end of Confederate resistance. Jefferson Davis and his government flee the capital as Union troops occupy the city that had symbolized Confederate independence for 4 years. Lincoln visits the fallen Confederate capital, walking through streets lined with liberated enslaved people who hail him as their liberator. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, brings the war's military phase to its inevitable conclusion. Surrounded and outnumbered, Lee recognizes that further resistance would only bring more suffering without changing the outcome. Grant's generous surrender terms. Confederate officers keep their swords. Soldiers take their horses home for spring planting, begin the process of national reconciliation. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln on April 14, 1865, robs the nation of its most important leader at the moment of victory. John Wilkes Booth's bullet removes the one man who might have managed Reconstruction with both firmness and mercy. Lincoln dies believing he has preserved the Union and freed the enslaved. But the work of rebuilding America remains unfinished. Total war achieves what limited conflict could not complete: Confederate defeat and slavery's destruction. But victory's cost proves staggering. Over 620,000 Americans dead, the South's economy and infrastructure in ruins, and deep sectional bitterness that will poison American politics for generations. The war that began as a constitutional dispute has become a social revolution that transforms America forever. Chapter 8. The Unfinished Revolution, 1865 to 1877. The Steps of the Capitol, March 4, 1865. Abraham Lincoln delivers his second inaugural address to a war-weary nation as the Confederacy collapses. With malice toward none, with charity for all, he declares, outlining his vision for healing America's wounds. Just 41 days later, an assassin's bullet silences Lincoln forever, leaving Reconstruction in the hands of men who lack his political genius and moral authority. The challenge facing America in 1865 defies easy solutions. How do you rebuild a nation torn apart by 4 years of total war? How do you integrate 4 million newly freed people into American society? How do you punish rebellion while promoting reconciliation? The answers to these questions will determine whether the Civil War, as sacrifices, produce lasting change or temporary victory. Andrew Johnson's ascension to the presidency fundamentally alters Reconstruction's trajectory. Lincoln's Tennessee-born vice president shares none of his predecessor's political skills or commitment to racial equality. Johnson views Reconstruction as a process of quickly restoring Southern states to the Union with minimal changes to pre-war social relations, excluding only the planter elite who led secession. Johnson's lenient policies shock Republicans who expected fundamental changes in Southern society. His wholesale pardoning of Confederate leaders restores political power to the same men who led secession. His opposition to black suffrage conflicts with Republican beliefs about the war's meaning. Most provocatively, he vetoes legislation extending the Freedmen's Bureau and guaranteeing civil rights for former enslaved people. The Black Codes enacted by Johnson restored Southern governments reveal white Southerners' determination to maintain racial control despite slavery as abolition. These laws severely restrict African Americans' economic opportunities, political rights, and physical mobility. In Mississippi, black people cannot rent land outside towns or carry weapons. In South Carolina, they face heavy fines for leaving employment without permission. The code's harshness convinces many Northerners that the South has learned nothing from defeat. Republicans, who initially supported Johnson's moderate approach, begin demanding stronger federal intervention. The 1866 congressional elections give Republicans massive majorities committed to a more radical reconstruction of Southern society. Congressional Reconstruction begins with the Reconstruction Acts of 1867. Dividing the South into 5 military districts under federal oversight. Former Confederate states must ratify the 14th Amendment, guaranteeing equal protection under law, and draft new constitutions providing black male suffrage. Only then can they rejoin the Union and end military occupation. The 14th Amendment represents the war's most important legal legacy. Its Equal Protection Clause revolutionizes American constitutional law by requiring state governments to treat all citizens equally. The amendment, as definition of citizenship, overturns Dred Scott and establishes that all people born in the United States are citizens regardless of race. African Americans embrace their new political rights with remarkable enthusiasm. Despite being denied education under slavery, black voters participate in elections at rates exceeding white turnout. They elect dozens of black legislators, lieutenant governors, and congressmen throughout the South. Hiram Revels of Mississippi becomes the first African American senator, taking Jefferson Davis's former seat. Reconstruction governments achieve remarkable progress in democratizing Southern society. They establish public school systems that educate both races, though usually in separate facilities. They rebuild war-damaged infrastructure, promote economic development, and guarantee civil rights previously restricted to whites. South Carolina's 1868 Constitution becomes the most democratic in the state's history. But Reconstruction faces violent resistance from white Southerners determined to restore racial hierarchy. The Ku Klux Klan emerges as the most notorious of many terrorist organizations dedicated to overthrowing Republican governments through intimidation and murder. Klansmen target black political leaders, white Republicans, and anyone who challenges white supremacy. The violence reaches staggering levels throughout the early 1870s. In Colfax, Louisiana, white Democrats massacre over 100 black Republicans attempting to protect the local courthouse. In Hamburg, South Carolina, rifle clubs attack black militiamen, killing 7. Federal authorities struggle to maintain order across the vast Southern territory with limited troops and uncertain legal authority. The 15th Amendment in 1870 prohibits denying voting rights based on race, but enforcement proves problematic. Southern Democrats develop new methods of voter suppression that technically comply with constitutional requirements while effectively disenfranchising black voters. Poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses reduce black political participation without explicitly mentioning race. Economic Reconstruction proves as challenging as political Reconstruction. The collapse of slavery destroys the South's labor system without creating adequate replacements. Sharecropping emerges as a compromise between black desires for land ownership and white control of agricultural production. But sharecropping often recreates slavery's economic exploitation under different legal arrangements. The Freedmen's Bureau attempts to ease the transition from slavery to freedom by providing education, medical care, and legal assistance to former enslaved people. Bureau agents help negotiate labor contracts, establish schools, and protect black civil rights. But the agency faces enormous challenges with limited resources and faces constant political attacks from white Southerners and conservative Republicans. Northern commitment to Reconstruction weakens throughout the 1870s as economic depression and political scandals distract attention from Southern affairs. The Panic of 1873 creates widespread unemployment and business failures, making voters more concerned with economic recovery than civil rights enforcement. Corruption scandals in the Grant administration damage Republican credibility and provide ammunition for Democratic attacks. The disputed election of 1876 effectively ends Reconstruction as a national priority. Neither Rutherford Hayes nor Samuel Tilden wins a clear electoral majority, throwing the decision to Congress. The Compromise of 1877 awards the presidency to Hayes in exchange for withdrawing federal troops from the South and ending federal protection for black civil rights. The end of Reconstruction abandons African Americans to white Southern control just 12 years after emancipation. Southern Democrats quickly implement Jim Crow laws that segregate public facilities and disenfranchise black voters through legal subterfuge. The Supreme Court's 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson decision legitimizes segregation under the fiction of separate but equal treatment. Reconstruction's failure represents one of American history's greatest tragedies. The period's Democratic achievements, black political participation, public education, civil rights laws, prove temporary as white supremacy reasserts control. The generation of African Americans who experienced freedom and political power during Reconstruction will spend their remaining years watching those gains systematically destroyed. Yet Reconstruction also plants seeds that will eventually flourish in the 20th century. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments provide constitutional foundations for the modern civil rights movement. The precedent of federal intervention to protect minority rights establishes principles that future generations will invoke to challenge racial oppression. The unfinished revolution of Reconstruction demonstrates that military victory cannot guarantee social transformation. Changing laws proves easier than changing hearts and minds. The Civil War destroys slavery as a legal institution, but cannot eliminate the racial attitudes that justified it. America will spend the next century struggling with the contradictions between its democratic ideals and racial realities. Chapter 9. The Economic Transformation. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, 1870. The sky glows orange from dozens of blast furnaces working around the clock to feed America's industrial appetite. Where peaceful farmland existed before the war, sprawling factories now produce rails, weapons, and machinery for a rapidly expanding nation. The Civil War has unleashed an economic revolution that transforms America from an agricultural republic into an industrial empire. The statistics tell the story of unprecedented growth. In 1860, America produces 13,000 tons of steel annually. By 1880, production reaches 1.4 million tons. Railroad mileage doubles from 30,000 to 60,000 miles. Telegraph lines connect every major city, while corporations grow to sizes unimaginable before. The conflict that nearly destroyed the nation paradoxically creates the foundation for its emergence as a global economic power. The war's financing requirements revolutionize American banking and monetary systems. Before 1861, the federal government relies primarily on tariffs and land sales for revenue. The war's enormous costs over $3 billion for the Union alone require new forms of taxation and borrowing that permanently expand federal economic authority. The Legal Tender Act of 1862 creates the first federal currency in American history. These greenbacks finance Union war efforts, but also establish the federal government's monetary authority. The National Banking Act of 1863 creates a network of federally chartered banks that standardize currency and credit across the continent. These wartime measures lay the foundation for modern American financial systems. Northern industry expands dramatically under wartime demand. Textile mills run constantly to provide uniforms, blankets, and other military supplies. Iron and steel production increases to manufacture weapons, ships, and railroad equipment. The McCormick Reaper factory in Chicago employs 1,500 workers by war's end, compared to fewer than 300 in 1,860. Government contracts create the first great industrial fortunes of the modern era. Andrew Carnegie begins his steel empire by supplying railroad bridges to the Union Army. J.P. Morgan makes millions, financing government bond sales. Cornelius Vanderbilt expands his transportation empire by moving troops and supplies. The war that costs hundreds of thousands of lives makes a handful of entrepreneurs incredibly wealthy. Immigration accelerates despite wartime disruption as Europeans seek opportunities in America's booming economy. Over 800,000 immigrants arrived during the 1860s, providing labor for expanding factories and filling depleted Union Army ranks. German and Irish immigrants particularly benefit from wartime employment opportunities, beginning their integration into American middle-class society. The Homestead Act of 1862 revolutionizes Western development by offering 160-acre farms to anyone willing to cultivate the land for 5 years. The law attracts hundreds of thousands of settlers to the Great Plains, creating new agricultural communities that supply food for urban populations. Railroad construction accelerates to connect these settlements to eastern markets, completing the continental transportation network. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, represents the war generation's greatest peacetime achievement. Built by Union Pacific crews working westward from Omaha and Central Pacific teams advancing eastward from Sacramento, the railroad reduces cross-continental travel time from months to days. The project requires enormous government subsidies, over 175 million acres of land grants, but creates national economic integration. Southern economic devastation contrasts sharply with Northern prosperity. Sherman's march and other campaigns destroy much of the South's industrial capacity, transportation infrastructure, and agricultural machinery. Confederate currency becomes worthless, wiping out savings and investment capital. The region's economy reverts to subsistence agriculture, while the North surges ahead industrially. The abolition of slavery eliminates the South's primary form of capital human property, worth an estimated $3 billion in 1860. Former slaveholders receive no compensation for their losses, creating massive wealth destruction that hobbles Southern economic recovery for generations. The region lacks capital for industrial development and remains dependent on agricultural exports sold in increasingly competitive global markets. Sharecropping emerges as the dominant Southern labor system, but proves economically inefficient compared to wage labor in competitive markets. Sharecroppers have little incentive to improve productivity since they don't own their land. Landowners cannot efficiently supervise scattered tenant farmers. The system maintains agricultural production, but prevents the capital accumulation necessary for economic modernization. The war accelerates technological innovation as military necessity drives rapid development. Breech-loading rifles, ironclad warships, and telegraph communications represent just a few of the innovations that emerge from wartime experimentation. The experience of managing large-scale military operations teaches valuable lessons about logistics, organization, and coordination that prove applicable to civilian industry. Corporate organization evolves to handle the scale and complexity of modern industrial enterprises. Before the war, most businesses remained small partnerships or family enterprises. Wartime demand requires larger organizations with professional management, specialized functions, and sophisticated financial controls. The modern corporation emerges from these wartime innovations. Labor relations become increasingly contentious as workers organize to demand better wages and working conditions. The war creates labor shortages that strengthen workers' bargaining position, but industrialists resist permanent changes to traditional employment relationships. The first major post-war strikes occur in 1877, revealing tensions between capital and labor that will dominate the next half-century. The Pacific Railway Act and other wartime legislation established the precedent for federal involvement in economic development. Government subsidies for railroad construction, land grants for agricultural development, and tariff protection for domestic industry create a partnership between government and business that shapes American capitalism for generations. Banking consolidation accelerates after the war as successful financiers like J.P. Morgan acquire smaller institutions and create powerful financial networks. The concentration of banking capital in New York establishes Wall Street as the nation's financial center and creates the institutional framework for financing large-scale industrial development. The economic transformation unleashed by the Civil War creates modern industrial America within a generation. The agricultural society that existed before 1861 gives way to an urban, industrial nation that will become the world's dominant economic power by 1900. But this transformation also creates new forms of inequality, social tension, and environmental degradation that challenge American democratic ideals. The war's economic legacy proves as lasting as its political consequences. The expansion of federal authority, the integration of national markets, and the rise of large corporations establish patterns that define American capitalism through the 20th century. The conflict that began as a dispute over slavery as expansion becomes the catalyst for America as transformation into a modern industrial society. Chapter 10. The Cultural Reckoning, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, November 19, 1863. As Lincoln speaks his immortal words about government of the people, by the people, for the people, he addresses more than battlefield dedication. He articulates a new vision of American identity forged in the crucible of civil war. The conflict transforms not just politics and economics, but the very meaning of what it means to be American. The war forces Americans to confront fundamental questions about their national character. Is America primarily a voluntary union of sovereign states or an indivisible nation? Do Americans share common values and destiny, or are they merely citizens of convenience? The guns of Gettysburg and Vicksburg provide bloody answers that reshape American culture for generations. Literature becomes a battlefield where competing visions of American identity clash with extraordinary intensity. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, sells over 300,000 copies in its first year and profoundly shapes Northern attitudes toward slavery. Southerners respond with novels like Carolyn Lee Hence's The Planter's Northern Bride, defending slavery as beneficial to both races. The literary war extends far beyond these famous works into a vast outpouring of pamphlets, poems, and popular fiction that attempt to define American character. Northern writers like Lydia Maria Child and William Lloyd Garrison produce anti-slavery literature that portrays the conflict as a struggle between good and evil, democracy and despotism. Their works create a moral framework that transforms political disagreement into religious crusade. Southern writers counter with their own literary arsenal, defending their region's honor and institutions. William Gilmore Simms, known as the Cooper of the South, writes novels celebrating plantation society and Southern chivalry. Thomas Nelson Page's post-war stories romanticize the Old South as a lost paradise destroyed by Yankee aggression. These works create the literary foundation for the lost cause mythology that will influence American culture for decades. The war itself generates an unprecedented outpouring of personal writing as ordinary soldiers and civilians struggle to record their experiences. Soldiers' letters home reveal the transformation of naive volunteers into hardened veterans who have witnessed industrial-scale killing. Mary, Chestnut's diary provides an intimate portrait of Confederate society's gradual disintegration under military pressure. These personal accounts create the first authentic American literature of modern warfare. The war produces the first great American war literature as writers struggle to capture the conflict as unprecedented scale and suffering. Walt Whitman serves as a hospital volunteer in Washington, transforming his observations into poetry that captures both war's horror and nobility. His When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed becomes America's greatest elegy for Lincoln and the war's fallen soldiers. Whitman's hospital experiences expose him to suffering on a scale never before witnessed in America. His notebooks record the names and stories of thousands of wounded soldiers from both armies, creating an archive of individual tragedy within the larger national catastrophe. His poem, The Wound Dresser, captures the intimate details of caring for mangled bodies while finding dignity in service to suffering humanity. The democratizing effect of Whitman's poetry reflects the war's broader cultural impact. His free verse style rejects European literary conventions, just as American democracy rejects aristocratic political traditions. His celebration of common soldiers and ordinary Americans creates a distinctly democratic aesthetic that influences American literature for generations. Ambrose Bierce's Civil War stories, written decades after his service in the Union Army, strip away romantic notions of military glory to reveal war's brutal reality. An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge and other tales use innovative literary techniques to explore the psychological trauma that haunts a generation of veterans. Bierce's work establishes American literature's tradition of anti-war writing. Bierce's literary innovations reflect his understanding that traditional narrative techniques cannot adequately represent the discontinuous, fragmented experience of modern warfare. His use of stream-of-consciousness narration, unreliable perspectives, and fractured chronology anticipates modernist literary techniques that will fractured chronology anticipates modernist literary techniques that will fractured chronology emerge after World War I. His work demonstrates how technological warfare requires new forms of artistic expression. Photography revolutionizes how Americans understand warfare and death. Matthew Brady and his assistants bring the battlefield into American homes for the first time through graphic images of corpse-strewn fields and ruined cities. Alexander Gardner's photographs of dead soldiers at Antietam shock viewers accustomed to romanticized battle paintings, making war's human cost undeniably real. The impact of Civil War photography extends far beyond its immediate documentary value. These images create America's first visual record of mass death, establishing photography's power to witness and preserve historical events. Brady's portrait studio work also democratizes image-making, allowing ordinary families to possess photographs of their soldier sons and husbands, often the only visual records of young men who never return home. The technical challenges of Civil War photography influence the medium's artistic development. Long exposure times require subjects to remain motionless, creating formal, dignified portraits that contrast with the chaos of battle. Photographers must transport heavy equipment and dangerous chemicals across difficult terrain, making their work an extension of military logistics. The war transforms American religion as churches struggle to reconcile Christian teaching with unprecedented violence and suffering. Northern ministers preach the battle hymn of the Republic, transforming military conflict into holy crusade against slavery. Southern clergy invoke divine protection for their righteous cause of defending Christian civilization against the Yankee aggression. The theological implications of the war's carnage force American Christianity to grapple with fundamental questions about divine providence and human suffering. Traditional Protestant emphasis on moral progress and divine blessing appears inadequate when confronted with battles like Antietam. where 23,000 Americans become casualties in a single day. Ministers struggle to explain how a benevolent God permits such unprecedented destruction among Christian peoples. Some religious leaders embrace the war as divine judgment on American sin, particularly the sin of slavery. They interpret Union victories as evidence of God's favor for the anti-slavery cause, while Confederate defeats prove divine condemnation of human bondage. This interpretation transforms military events into religious revelation, making the war itself a form of scripture. Combat experience challenges soldiers. Religious faith as traditional answers prove inadequate for explaining mass slaughter among Christians. Some veterans lose faith entirely, while others develop more complex understanding of divine providence and human suffering. The war produces both increased religious skepticism and new forms of evangelical Christianity that emphasize personal salvation over social reform. The democratizing effect of military service also challenges traditional religious authority. Soldiers who survive horrific battles develop confidence in their own spiritual insights, sometimes rejecting clerical interpretation of religious truth. The war's aftermath sees the growth of spiritualism and other alternative religious movements that promise direct communication with the deceased, appealing to families desperate to maintain contact with fallen loved ones. Camp revivals become crucial elements of soldier culture as men facing death seek spiritual comfort and community. These services break down denominational barriers as Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, and others worship together in the face of common danger. The shared experience of conversion and religious enthusiasm creates bonds that transcend regional and class differences. Women's roles expand dramatically as military necessity breaks down traditional gender barriers. Clara Barton pioneers battlefield nursing, while other women work as spies, disguise themselves as soldiers, or manage farms and businesses while men fight. The war demonstrates women's capability in roles previously reserved for men, strengthening arguments for female suffrage and expanded rights. The expansion of women's roles extends far beyond the celebrated examples of battlefield nurses and disguised soldiers. On the home front, women take over traditionally male occupations in unprecedented numbers. They become teachers, clerks, factory workers, and farm managers out of necessity rather than choice. The federal government employs women as clerks for the first time, establishing precedents for female participation in public administration. Women's participation in war relief efforts creates new forms of public activism that challenge traditional restrictions on female political involvement. The United States Sanitary Commission, led by women like Mary M. Bickerdike and Dorothea Dix, organizes relief efforts on a national scale. These organizations provide women with experience in large-scale administration and political advocacy that proves invaluable for post-war reform movements. The cult of domesticity, the belief that women's proper sphere is the home, faces challenges from wartime reality but ultimately survives the conflict. Women's wartime service is celebrated as extension of their natural nurturing instincts, rather than evidence of their equality with men. Most women return to traditional roles after the war, though their experience provides foundation for later feminist activism. The ideological framework of separate spheres actually expands during the war to justify women's public activities as extensions of their domestic responsibilities. Women's participation in war relief is interpreted as caring for the national family, while their involvement in anti-slavery activism represents protection of enslaved women and children. This framework allows expanded female activity while maintaining traditional gender hierarchies. Education undergoes significant changes as the war reveals American intellectual deficiencies compared to European nations. The Morrill Act of 1862 establishes land-grant colleges to promote agricultural and mechanical education, creating institutions like Cornell, Michigan State, and the University of California. These schools democratize higher education and emphasize practical training over classical curriculum. The wartime emphasis on practical education reflects broader cultural changes that prioritize technological innovation and economic development over classical learning. The old college curriculum based on Latin, Greek, and moral philosophy seems inadequate for a nation engaged in industrial warfare. Engineering, agriculture, and scientific subjects gain prestige as essential for national power and prosperity. The democratizing impact of expanded education extends beyond curriculum changes to include broader access to learning opportunities. The Morrill Act's provision for educating the industrial classes breaks down elite control of higher education, making college training available to farmers and workers' sons. This educational expansion provides the skilled workforce necessary for America's post-war industrial development. Primary education expands rapidly, particularly in the South, where Reconstruction governments established public school systems for the first time. Northern missionaries and teachers travel south to educate former enslaved people, creating institutions like Fisk University and Hampton Institute that train black teachers and leaders. These efforts face violent resistance but establish educational foundations that survive Reconstruction's end. The expansion of black education represents one of the war's most revolutionary consequences. Enslaved people had been systematically denied literacy as a means of social control, making education a powerful symbol of freedom. The establishment of schools becomes a priority for African American communities throughout the South, despite wide opposition and economic hardship. Music emerges as a powerful vehicle for expressing wartime emotions and cementing national identity. The Battle Hymn of the Republic transforms the melody of John Brown's Body into Union anthem, linking military success to divine approval. Confederate songs like Dixie and The Bonnie Blue Flag celebrate Southern distinctiveness and resistance to federal authority. The musical culture of Civil War camps creates new forms of American popular music that blend regional traditions into national styles. Soldiers from different backgrounds share their musical heritage, creating hybrid forms that influence post-war American music. Military bands become vehicles for musical innovation as they adapt classical pieces for outdoor performance and incorporate folk melodies into their repertoires. The emotional power of wartime music extends far beyond entertainment to provide crucial psychological support for soldiers and civilians facing unprecedented stress. Songs like Home Sweet Home and The Blue and the Gray help maintain morale by connecting military service to domestic values and shared humanity. These musical traditions establish patterns of American war culture that persist through subsequent conflicts. Spirituals created by enslaved people gain wider recognition as African Americans assert their cultural identity and contributions to American society. Songs like Go Down, Moses, and Swing Low, Sweet Chariot express both religious faith and freedom desires, becoming part of America's musical heritage. The Fisk Jubilee Singers introduce white audiences to this musical tradition during post-war concert tours. The recognition of African American musical contributions represents a crucial step in the cultural integration of formerly enslaved people into American society. Spirituals provide evidence of black cultural sophistication that challenges racist stereotypes about African American intellectual capacity. The success of groups like the Fisk Jubilee Singers demonstrates black artistic talent while raising funds for educational institutions. Art and architecture reflect the war's impact on American aesthetics and values. Painters like Winslow Homer capture both war's drama and its aftermath in works like Prisoners from the Front and The Veteran in a New Field. These paintings avoid glorifying military conflict while honoring soldiers' service and sacrifice. The development of a distinctly American artistic tradition accelerates during the war as artists struggle to represent uniquely American experiences. European artistic conventions prove inadequate for depicting democratic armies and industrial warfare, forcing American artists to develop new visual languages. This artistic innovation parallels literary developments that create authentically American forms of expression. Monument building becomes a major cultural phenomenon as communities memorialize the war's heroes and lessons. The Lincoln Memorial in Washington epitomizes this trend, transforming the prairie lawyer into an American symbol of democratic idealism and racial justice. Confederate monuments serve different purposes, celebrating the lost cause mythology that romanticizes Southern defeat and minimizes slavery's importance. The design and placement of Civil War monuments reflect competing interpretations of the war's meaning and legacy. Union monuments typically emphasize victory, union, and emancipation, often featuring symbolic figures representing liberty and justice. Confederate monuments focus on sacrifice, honor, and resistance, usually depicting individual soldiers or commanders rather than abstract ideals. Language itself changes as the war introduces new vocabulary and concepts into American discourse. Terms like contraband, copperhead, and shoddy enter common usage, while military metaphors pervade civilian conversation. The war's scale requires new ways of describing mass death and destruction that challenge traditional literary conventions. The linguistic innovations of the Civil War era reflect broader cultural changes that transform American identity from provincial reflection of European models into distinctive national expression. Military terminology enters civilian vocabulary, while democratic ideals influence literary style and artistic expression. These changes create cultural foundations for America's emergence as a world power in the 20th century. Chapter 11. The Lasting Scars, Arlington National Cemetery, Memorial Day, 1868. For the first time, Americans gathered to honor their Civil War dead with flowers and speeches. General John Logan has proclaimed this Decoration Day to ensure that the sacrifice of Union soldiers will never be forgotten. But as mourners place wreaths on thousands of graves, a troubling question haunts the ceremony. What has America gained from such devastating loss? 3 years after Appomattox, the war's immediate consequences are clear. Slavery is abolished, the Union is preserved, and federal authority is strengthened. But the deeper wounds, social, psychological, and moral, resist easy healing. The America that emerges from the Civil War bears scars that will shape the nation's character for generations to come. The human cost defies comprehension. Over 620,000 Americans died in 4 years of fighting, more than all other American wars combined until Vietnam. The South loses nearly 1/4 of its white male population of military age. Every American community, North and South, mourns sons, fathers, and brothers who will never return home. The war creates America's first generation of mass grief. These raw statistics only hint at the personal tragedies that multiplied across the continent. In the small town of Gettysburg alone, 51,000 casualties from 3 days of fighting created logistical nightmares that lasted for months. Local residents found themselves caring for wounded soldiers in their homes, barns, and churches. The smell of death lingered over the town for weeks as burial details worked to inter the fallen from both armies. Sarah Broadhead, a Gettysburg resident, wrote in her diary, "The dead cover the field. It is dreadful to think of so many fine young men cut down like wheat before the scythe." Her words capture the agricultural metaphor that many Americans use to describe the industrial scale slaughter that characterized Civil War battles. The romantic notions of individual combat and glorious death that had inspired young men to enlist gave way to grim reality of mass killing by rifle fire and artillery. Families throughout the nation struggle with absence and loss that traditional mourning rituals cannot address. Mary Todd Lincoln never recovers from her husband's assassination, becoming increasingly unstable as she grapples with overwhelming grief. She represents thousands of civil war widows forced to rebuild their lives without husbands and often without adequate financial support. The widows' experience varied dramatically by region and social class. Northern widows of Union soldiers eventually received federal pensions, though the amounts were often inadequate and the bureaucracy was slow to respond. Southern widows faced much harsher circumstances, as the Confederate government collapsed and state governments lacked resources to provide meaningful assistance. Many were forced to take in boarders, work as seamstresses, or depend on the charity of extended family members who were themselves struggling economically. The psychological impact extended far beyond immediate family members. Entire communities were traumatized by the scale of loss. In some southern counties, virtually every family lost at least one male relative. The social fabric that had held these communities together for generations was torn apart, never to be fully repaired. Church congregations that had once been centers of social life found themselves conducting funeral services week after week, often without bodies to bury. Veterans returned home bearing invisible wounds that 19th century medicine cannot treat or even understand. Soldiers' letters describe symptoms that modern psychiatrists recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder nightmares: emotional numbness, inability to adjust to civilian life. Jacob Mendez da Costa identifies soldier's heart, a condition of rapid pulse and chest pain that appears related to combat stress. The medical understanding of psychological trauma was virtually non-existent during the 1860s. Soldiers who exhibited symptoms of what we now recognize as PTSD were often dismissed as cowards or malingerers. The concept of nostalgia, roughly equivalent to severe depression, was recognized as a medical condition, but treatment consisted mainly of rest and encouragement to be more manly. Many veterans turned to alcohol to numb their psychological pain, creating the stereotype of the hard-drinking Civil War veteran that persisted well into the 20th century. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who would later become a Supreme Court justice, was wounded 3 times during his service with the 20th Massachusetts Infantry. He struggled for decades with what he called the incommunicable experience of combat. In letters to friends, he described feeling like a ghost among the living, unable to relate to civilians who had not shared the horror of battle. His experience was typical of combat veterans who found civilian life pale and meaningless after the intensity of warfare. The Grand Army of the Republic, founded in 1866, becomes America's first large veterans organization, providing social support and political advocacy for Union veterans. The GAR's political influence shapes American politics for decades, securing pension benefits and maintaining Republican electoral dominance in many northern states. Confederate veterans organize similar groups, though they face greater economic hardship and political restrictions. The GAR evolved into much more than a veterans organization. It became a powerful political machine that influenced American politics for 50 years. At its peak in the 1890s, the organization claimed over 400,000 members and could deliver crucial votes in swing states. GAR endorsement became essential for Republican candidates, and the organization's annual conventions were major political events that attracted national attention. The GAR's pension campaign succeeded beyond the wildest dreams of its founders. By 1900, federal spending on Civil War pensions consumed over 40% of the national budget, a higher percentage than military spending during the war itself. The Disability Pension Act of 1890 extended benefits to any Union veteran who could prove any disability, whether service-related or not, effectively creating an old-age pension system for Northern veterans. Confederate veterans faced a very different post-war experience. The United Confederate Veterans, founded in 1889, provided camaraderie and mutual support, but lacked the political power to secure significant benefits. Southern state governments, impoverished by defeat and Reconstruction, could offer only token assistance. Confederate veterans' homes were established in most Southern states, but they were poorly funded and often overcrowded. The contrast in veteran treatment reflected broader patterns of post-war inequality. Northern industrial prosperity enabled generous support for Union veterans, while Southern economic devastation left Confederate veterans largely on their own. This disparity reinforced sectional resentments and contributed to the mythology of the lost cause that portrayed Southern soldiers as noble victims of Northern aggression. Racial reconciliation proves even more elusive than sectional healing. The end of Reconstruction in 1877 abandons African Americans to white Southern control, leading to systematic disenfranchisement and segregation that will persist until the 1960s. The dream of racial equality that motivated many Union soldiers dies in the compromise that ends federal protection for black civil rights. The abandonment of Reconstruction marked one of the great moral failures in American history. The generation of black Americans who had experienced freedom and political participation during the late 1860s and early 1870s lived to see their gains systematically destroyed. Men who had served in state legislatures, held federal offices, and voted in competitive elections found themselves disenfranchised and relegated to second-class citizenship. The methods used to disenfranchise black voters were sophisticated and effective. Literacy tests that required interpretation of complex constitutional provisions were administered by white registrars who could pass or fail applicants at will. Poll taxes were set at levels that excluded most black farmers and laborers. Grandfather clauses allowed illiterate whites to vote while excluding blacks whose grandfathers had been enslaved. These measures were carefully crafted to appear race-neutral while achieving racial exclusion. Violence and intimidation supplemented legal disenfranchisement. The Ku Klux Klan and similar organizations terrorized black communities through lynchings, beatings, and economic boycotts. Between 1877 and 1950, over 4,000 African Americans were lynched, often for alleged crimes that would have resulted in jail time for white offenders. These lynchings served as public spectacles designed to reinforce white supremacy and black subordination. The lost cause mythology emerges as Southern whites attempt to find meaning in defeat. This romanticized interpretation portrays the Confederacy as defending constitutional principles rather than slavery, depicts enslaved people as happy under paternalistic care, and celebrates Confederate generals as American heroes. Lost cause ideology influences American historical understanding well into the 20th century. The lost cause narrative served multiple psychological and political functions for white Southerners. It allowed them to maintain dignity in defeat by arguing that they had fought for noble principles rather than an ignoble cause. It justified continued resistance to federal authority by portraying Reconstruction as a legal oppression. Most importantly, it provided historical justification for the white supremacist system that replaced slavery. Organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy played crucial roles in promoting lost cause mythology. They funded Confederate monuments, influenced textbook selection in Southern schools, and sponsored historical writing that minimized slavery's importance in causing the war. Their efforts were remarkably successful by 1920. Most American history textbooks presented the war as a tragic conflict between equally noble sections rather than a struggle over human bondage. The influence of lost cause mythology extended far beyond the South. Northern publishers found Southern markets lucrative and gradually adopted more balanced interpretations that avoided offending Southern sensibilities. Hollywood films like Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind spread romanticized images of the Old South to national and international audiences. Monument building reflects competing memories of the war's meaning and legacy. Union monuments typically celebrate victory and emancipation, while Confederate memorials honor sacrifice and resistance. The placement of Confederate monuments in public spaces during the Jim Crow era asserts white supremacist interpretation of the war's legacy, creating controversies that persist into the 21st century. The timing of Confederate monument construction reveals their political purpose. Most were erected during two distinct periods: the 1890s-1910s, when Jim Crow laws were being implemented, and the 1950s-1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement. These monuments served as assertions of white supremacy during periods when that supremacy was being challenged. The monuments themselves embodied specific historical narratives. Confederate soldiers were typically portrayed as noble warriors defending their homes, not as fighters for slavery. Inscriptions emphasized themes of honor, sacrifice, and constitutional principle, while avoiding any mention of slavery or racial subordination. The monuments created sacred spaces where lost cause mythology could be reinforced through annual commemorative ceremonies. Union monuments told different stories, but were often equally selective in their historical narratives. Many emphasized the preservation of the Union while downplaying emancipation, reflecting Northern desires for reconciliation with white Southerners. African American contributions to Union victory were largely ignored in monument iconography, reinforcing the marginalization of Black Americans in post-Reconstruction society. Economic inequality increases as industrialization creates vast fortunes for some while leaving others in poverty. The war generation of capitalists, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan, accumulates wealth unprecedented in American history. Meanwhile, farmers and industrial workers struggle with economic instability that triggers periodic depressions and labor unrest throughout the late 19th century. The Civil War accelerated the concentration of capital that would characterize the Gilded Age economy. Government contracts during the war allowed entrepreneurs to accumulate the initial capital necessary for large-scale industrial enterprises. The same men who profited from wartime production used their wealth to dominate peacetime industries, creating monopolistic combinations that controlled entire sectors of the economy. Andrew Carnegie's steel empire exemplified this pattern. His initial profits came from supplying railroad bridges to the Union Army, but he used these gains to build integrated steel production facilities that undercut competitors and dominated markets. By 1900, Carnegie's company controlled 25% of American steel production and had made him one of the world's richest men. The new industrial economy created unprecedented disparities between capital and labor. Factory workers faced dangerous working conditions, long hours, and wages that barely supported their families. The periodic depressions that struck in 1873, 1893, and 1907 threw millions out of work while leaving the fortunes of industrial magnates largely intact. These disparities led to increasing labor unrest and the growth of socialist and anarchist movements. Farmers also struggled with the new industrial economy. The expansion of railroad networks allowed Western agricultural production to compete with Eastern farms, driving down prices. Farmers found themselves caught between falling commodity prices and rising costs for manufactured goods, railroad transportation, and borrowed money. The populist movement of the 1890s emerged from farmer frustration with an economic system that seemed rigged against agricultural producers. Women's rights advanced slowly, despite their wartime contributions. The 15th Amendment grants suffrage to Black men, but not to women of any race, creating divisions within the reform movement. Women's wartime experiences provide arguments for expanded rights, but traditional gender roles reassert themselves in peacetime. Female suffrage will require another 50 years of activism. The exclusion of women from the 15th Amendment created lasting divisions within the reform movement. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, longtime abolitionists, felt betrayed by male reformers who argued that this was the Negro's hour and that women's rights would have to wait. The resulting split between women's rights activists and civil rights advocates weakened both movements and delayed progress on gender and racial equality. Women's wartime experiences had demonstrated their capabilities in traditionally male roles, but peacetime society was reluctant to acknowledge these demonstrations. Women who had managed farms and businesses while men fought were expected to return to domestic roles when veterans came home. The ideology of separate spheres that confined women to domestic roles actually intensified during the post-war period as society sought to restore traditional gender hierarchies disrupted by war. Nevertheless, some women used their wartime experiences to justify expanded public roles. Clara Barton founded the American Red Cross in 1881, building on her reputation as a Civil War nurse. Frances Willard transformed the Woman's Christian Temperance Union into a broad-based reform organization that advocated for women's suffrage along with prohibition. These women's organizations provided training grounds for female political activists and kept the cause of women's rights alive during difficult decades. Immigration accelerates as Europeans seek opportunities in America's expanding economy, but nativism grows stronger as established Americans fear competition and cultural change. The war's emphasis on national unity creates pressure for immigrants to assimilate rapidly, abandoning ethnic traditions in favor of American identity. This process creates both opportunity and trauma for immigrant communities. The post-war immigration surge brought millions of Europeans to America seeking economic opportunities in the expanding industrial economy. German and Irish immigrants, who had proven their patriotism through Civil War service, found increased acceptance in American society. But newer immigrant groups from Southern and Eastern Europe faced hostility from established Americans who questioned their ability to assimilate into Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture. The Chinese immigration to the West Coast created particularly intense nativism. Chinese workers had helped build the Transcontinental Railroad and provided essential labor for Western development. But their different physical appearance, cultural practices, and willingness to work for low wages made them targets for racist attacks. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 marked the first time America restricted immigration based on race, establishing precedents that would influence immigration policy for decades. Immigrant communities struggled to balance assimilation pressures with desires to maintain cultural traditions. Many established ethnic neighborhoods where they could speak their native languages, practice traditional religions, and maintain familiar social customs. But their children faced intense pressure to Americanize through public education and peer pressure, creating generational conflicts within immigrant families. Westward expansion accelerates as railroads and agricultural development transform the Great Plains. But expansion also intensifies conflicts with Native American tribes whose lands are needed for white settlement. The same military commanders who won the Civil War, Sherman, Sheridan, Custer, lead campaigns that virtually eliminate Native American resistance through warfare and cultural destruction. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 opened the Great Plains to large-scale agricultural settlement. The Homestead Act provided 160-acre farms to anyone willing to cultivate the land for 5 years, attracting hundreds of thousands of settlers to territories that had been Native American hunting grounds for centuries. This agricultural expansion required the removal or destruction of Native American communities that had lived on the plains for generations. The military tactics used against Native Americans reflected lessons learned during the Civil War. Generals like Sherman and Sheridan applied concepts of total war to their Indian campaigns, targeting civilian populations and economic resources rather than just warriors. The destruction of buffalo herds, which provided the economic foundation for Plains Indian societies, paralleled Sherman's destruction of Southern agriculture during his march through Georgia. The reservation system created for Native Americans resembled the concentration camps that would become familiar in the 20th century. Tribes were confined to limited territories, often far from their traditional homelands, and forced to depend on government rations for survival. Attempts to escape reservations were met with military force, while cultural practices like the sun dance were banned as obstacles to civilization. The Indian boarding school system represented the most systematic attempt at cultural destruction. Native American children were forcibly removed from their families and placed in institutions where they were forbidden to speak their native languages, practice traditional religions, or maintain tribal identities. The goal was to kill the Indian and save the man, destroying Native American cultures while preserving individual lives for assimilation into white society. Constitutional amendments enacted during Reconstruction established principles that will eventually support broader civil rights movements. The 13th Amendment's prohibition of slavery, the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, and the 15th Amendment's voting rights protections provide legal foundations for challenging racial discrimination. These amendments remain dormant during the Jim Crow era, but will prove crucial to the modern civil rights movement. The Reconstruction Amendments represented the most significant constitutional changes since the Bill of Rights, fundamentally altering the relationship between federal and state governments. The 13th Amendment not only abolished slavery, but also gave Congress power to enforce emancipation through appropriate legislation. The 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause would eventually be interpreted to prohibit all forms of state-sponsored racial discrimination. However, the Supreme Court's interpretation of these amendments during the late 19th century severely limited their effectiveness. The slaughterhouse cases of 1873 narrowly interpreted the 14th Amendment's privileges and immunities clause, while the civil rights cases of 1883 struck down federal legislation prohibiting private discrimination. Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 established the separate but equal doctrine that legitimized segregation for 60 years. Despite these setbacks, the Reconstruction Amendments provided constitutional foundations that civil rights advocates could invoke in future struggles. The NAACP's legal strategy during the mid-20th century was built on these amendments, particularly the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s finally fulfilled the promise of equality that the Reconstruction Amendments had written into the Constitution. Federal authority expands permanently as a result of wartime necessity. The income tax, national banking system, draft laws, and suspension of habeas corpus established precedents for federal intervention in areas previously reserved to states. This expansion of federal power enables progressive reforms in the 20th century, but also creates ongoing tensions over the balance between national authority and local control. The wartime expansion of federal authority represented a fundamental transformation of American government. Before 1861, the federal government's primary functions were foreign relations, postal service, and customs collection. The war required federal agencies to manage military recruitment, war production, financial policy, and internal security on an unprecedented scale. The Legal Tender Acts created national currency for the first time in American history, establishing federal control over monetary policy that continues today. The National Banking Acts created a network of federally chartered banks that provided uniform currency and credit standards across the continent. The income tax, though declared unconstitutional in 1895, established precedents that would be revived with the 16th Amendment in 1913. The draft laws represented the most direct federal intervention in individual lives. For the first time, the national government claimed authority to compel military service, overriding state governments and individual preferences. The suspension of habeas corpus allowed federal authorities to arrest and detain suspected traitors without trial, establishing precedents for wartime civil liberties restrictions that would be invoked in future conflicts. These expansions of federal authority created lasting changes in American political culture. Citizens who had previously looked to state and local governments for most public services now expected federal action on national problems. The precedents established during the Civil War enabled progressive reforms like food safety regulation, labor standards, and Social Security that would have been impossible under antebellum constitutional interpretations. Religious faith faces challenges from the war's destruction and the rise of scientific materialism. Darwin's theory of evolution, published just before the war, gains acceptance among educated Americans, while traditional religious beliefs face scrutiny. The war's carnage makes it difficult to maintain simple faith in divine providence, leading to more complex theological understandings of suffering and justice. The Civil War created a crisis of faith for many Americans who struggled to reconcile their belief in a benevolent God with the unprecedented suffering they witnessed. Traditional Protestant theology emphasized divine providence and moral progress, but these beliefs were difficult to maintain when observing the slaughter at battles like Antietam and Gettysburg. Some religious leaders responded by developing more sophisticated theologies that acknowledged the reality of evil and suffering while maintaining faith in ultimate divine justice. Others embraced social gospel movements that emphasized improving earthly conditions rather than preparing for heavenly rewards. Still others turned to spiritualism and other alternative religious movements that promised direct communication with the deceased. The publication of Darwin's Origin of Species in 1859 added scientific challenges to the theological crisis created by wartime suffering. Educated Americans increasingly accepted evolutionary theory, which challenged biblical accounts of creation and human nature. The conflict between science and religion that would culminate in the Scopes Trial of 1925 had its origins in the intellectual ferment of the Civil War era. Literature and art struggled to capture the war's meaning and legacy. The lost generation of World War I has precedence in Civil War veterans who cannot reconcile their combat experiences with pro-war values and beliefs. Writers like Ambrose Bierce and Stephen Crane develop new forms of realism that strip away romantic notions of military glory to reveal war's brutal reality. The Civil War created America's first generation of anti-war literature as veterans struggled to communicate their experiences to civilian audiences. Ambrose Bierce's short stories, based on his service in the Union Army, depicted warfare as meaningless slaughter rather than noble sacrifice. His An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge became a classic of American literature for its innovative exploration of death and consciousness. Walt Whitman's poetry offered a different response to wartime trauma, finding meaning in suffering through democratic identification with all Americans. His hospital visits in Washington inspired poems like When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloom Day that mourned Lincoln's death while celebrating the democratic ideals for which he died. Whitman's work established traditions of American war poetry that would influence writers through 2 world wars. Visual artists also struggled to represent the war's unprecedented destruction. Winslow Homer's paintings avoided glorifying combat while honoring soldiers' service and sacrifice. His The Veteran in a New Field depicted a former soldier returning to peaceful agriculture, suggesting hope for national healing. Matthew Brady's photographs brought battlefield reality into American homes for the first time, creating new forms of documentary art. The experience of mass trauma created by the Civil War influenced American culture for generations. The tradition of realistic war writing, established by Civil War veterans, provided models for later writers dealing with World War I, World War II, and Vietnam. The psychological insights developed by veterans struggling with combat trauma anticipated modern understanding of post-traumatic stress disorder. The war's cultural impact continues to influence American literature, film, and historical memory. Ken Burns's documentary series, The Civil War, attracted massive television audiences in 1990, demonstrating continued fascination with the conflict. Contemporary novels like Charles Frazer's Cold Mountain and films like Glory reinterpret the war's meaning for modern audiences while acknowledging its lasting trauma. The Civil War, as deepest legacy, may be its demonstration that American democracy can survive its greatest challenges while being fundamentally transformed by them. The conflict preserved the Union, but created a very different nation than had existed before 1861. The scars left by this transformation continue to shape American development as the nation struggles to fulfill the promises of equality and justice that were written in blood during 4 years of civil war. As we stand at the end of this epic journey through America's bloodiest trial, the magnitude of what transpired between 1861 and 1865 still takes our breath away. The Civil War was more than a conflict between North and South. It was a violent birth process that delivered a fundamentally different nation than the one that had existed since 1776. The America that fired on Fort Sumter was a loose confederation of states bound together by convenience and shared history. The America that emerged from Appomattox was a true nation, tested by fire and committed to principles worth dying for. The transformation came at a cost so staggering that its full measure can never be calculated over. 620,000 dead, countless wounded in body and spirit, and social trauma that would echo through generations. The war answered the fundamental questions that had plagued America since its founding. Could a nation conceived in liberty endure when half its people lived in bondage? Could democracy survive when citizens disagreed so fundamentally about basic moral principles? Could a federal union hold together when regional interests diverged so dramatically? The guns of Gettysburg and the march through Georgia provided conclusive answers written in blood and sacrifice. Lincoln's prophecy proved true. The house divided against itself could not stand. But out of that division came a new birth of freedom that extended the promise of equality beyond the narrow confines of race and region. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments established constitutional principles that would eventually support broader movements for civil rights and social justice. Yet the war's resolution created new contradictions that would challenge future generations. The failure of Reconstruction demonstrated that legal freedom without economic opportunity and political protection remains incomplete. The triumph of industrial capitalism created vast inequalities that mocked democratic ideals. The persistence of racial prejudice proved that hearts and minds change more slowly than laws and constitutions. The Civil War established patterns that would define American development for the next century. The expansion of federal authority, the growth of industrial capitalism, and the emergence of America as a potential world power all flowed from wartime innovations and necessities. The conflict that nearly destroyed the young republic actually prepared it for global leadership in the 20th century. Perhaps most importantly, the Civil War created a new understanding of American citizenship based on shared sacrifice rather than common ancestry. The immigrants who fought for the Union, the African Americans who gained freedom through military service, and the women who contributed to victory all earned claims to full participation in American society. These claims would not be honored immediately, but they established precedents that future movements would invoke. The war also revealed the terrible power of ideological conviction when compromise becomes impossible. Americans learned the principles held deeply enough can override family loyalty, economic interest, and even the instinct for self-preservation. This lesson carries both inspiration and warning for future generations who must balance moral conviction with political pragmatism. Looking forward from our vantage point in the 21st century, we can see how the Civil War's legacy continues to shape American life. The ongoing struggles over Confederate monuments, the persistence of racial inequality, and the tensions between federal and state authority all reflect unresolved issues from the 1860s. The war that was supposed to settle these questions forever actually established frameworks within which Americans continue to debate them. The Civil War, as greatest gift to posterity, may be its demonstration that American democracy can survive its greatest challenges. The Constitution proved flexible enough to accommodate unprecedented federal authority. The political system eventually absorbed the shock of emancipation and Reconstruction. The economy adapted to free labor and industrial transformation. The military tradition established during the war would serve America well into world wars and the Cold War. But the war also revealed the fragility of democratic institutions when citizens lose faith in shared values and common purpose. The polarization that led to secession offers sobering lessons for any era when Americans find themselves deeply divided along ideological lines. The violence that erupted when political compromise failed demonstrates the ultimate stakes of democratic governance. The men and women who lived through America's trial by fire understood that they were participants in an epic struggle whose outcome would determine the fate of democratic government worldwide. They rose to meet that challenge with courage, sacrifice, and determination that still inspires admiration. Their success in preserving the Union and extending freedom established America as a beacon of hope for oppressed people everywhere. The Civil War thus occupies a unique place in American memory, simultaneously the nation's greatest tragedy and its greatest triumph. The conflict that tore the country apart ultimately made it stronger, though at a cost that should never be forgotten or minimized. The America we inhabit today was forged in the crucible of civil war and bears the permanent imprint of that transformative experience. As we face our own challenges as a nation, the Civil War era offers both warning and inspiration. It warns us that democratic societies can fracture when citizens stop listening to each other and retreat into ideological extremism. It reminds us that the price of disunion is always higher than the cost of working through our differences peacefully. But it also inspires us with the example of Americans who sacrificed everything for principles larger than themselves. Lincoln's commitment to preserving the Union, Frederick Douglass's fight for equality, Clara Barton's service to the wounded, and countless ordinary soldiers who died for causes they believed in. These examples remind us that democracy requires active citizenship and sometimes supreme sacrifice. The Civil War teaches us that America's greatest strength lies not in the absence of conflict, but in the ability to resolve conflict through democratic means. The nation that emerged from the war was not perfect. A failure of Reconstruction proved that, but it was more committed to the ideals of equality and justice than the nation that entered the conflict. The war as legacy continues to unfold in our own time as Americans still struggle to fulfill the promises of equality and justice for all. The civil rights movement of the 1960s drew explicitly on Civil War precedents, invoking Lincoln's memory and the constitutional amendments born from that conflict. Contemporary debates over voting rights, economic inequality, and racial justice all reflect ongoing efforts to complete the unfinished work that Lincoln described at Gettysburg. Perhaps the Civil War's most enduring lesson is that freedom is never finally won, but must be constantly defended and extended. Each generation of Americans must decide anew what equality means, how democracy should function, and what principles are worth defending. The men and women of the 1860s made their choices and paid their price. The responsibility now falls to us to carry forward their legacy while learning from their mistakes. The house that was divided has been rebuilt, but it remains a work in progress. The foundation laid during the Civil War era constitutional amendments guaranteeing equality, federal authority to protect civil rights, and national commitment to democratic values provides the structure within which that work continues. The bloodshed on Civil War battlefields sanctified not just those particular fields, but the entire American experiment in self-government. As we face contemporary challenges to American democracy, we would do well to remember that our predecessors faced even greater tests and found the courage to meet them. The Civil War generation preserved the Union, ended slavery, and established principles that continue to guide American development. Their example reminds us that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they commit themselves to causes larger than their immediate interests. The American Civil War tore a nation apart so that it could be rebuilt on stronger foundations. The process was brutal, the cost was staggering, and the work remains incomplete. But the result was a country more committed to its founding ideals and better equipped to extend liberty and justice to all its people. That remains America's continuing challenge and its greatest promise. In the end, the Civil War's deepest meaning lies not in its political outcomes or military victories, but in its affirmation of human dignity and democratic possibility. The conflict that began as a dispute over slavery's expansion became a struggle for the soul of American democracy. The soldiers who died at Gettysburg and Antietam, the civilians who endured Sherman's march, and the freed people who claimed their liberty all participated in a transformation that made America more worthy of its founding promise. Their sacrifice demands that we continue the work they began, building a nation where government of the people, by the people, and for the people can indeed endure. The Civil War showed us the price of that commitment. It also showed us that the price is worth paying.